I still get excited with that.
It is, I never thought that we'd have our own theme song.
Theme song, opening credits, that we could have a YouTube channel, that it would actually work, that people would watch it. We have 27 whole subscribers. That's pretty great. But the listeners, that's where it really counts, because that's where you fell in love with us.
True.
That's where it all started. It all started.
Our lovely faces instead of our ugly voices. Or is it the other way around?
Well, it all started with a podcast.
That's true.
That
was almost a cooking show.
That was almost a cooking show. We could do it now.
Yeah.
We have YouTube.
That's true.
The Red Beans and Rice and Everything Nice episode could very easily become a culinary.
Now we just need a little GoPro on our foreheads every time we cook something decent.
You've got me thinking now. You've got me considering. Anyhow, this is a continuation of, if you look over in the corner, a continuation of our Market Garden 80 series of recordings. And we've got a special one on today, largely because, I say this as a guy who's literally got the Denison smock right over there and a para hat right over there and 82nd Airborne jump jacket behind me. It becomes a bit, as Joe Hook said in one of our recordings, paratastic, and we forget about everything else that's going on, like the other half of the operation. So to talk about Market Garden, at least the armored side of things, we've got with us Paul Reed. Paul is the host of the World War I podcast, Old Frontline. It's also the same name on the YouTube channel, Old Frontline. Make sure that you get out there and you subscribe to Paul's channel. And we, of course, ran into him on Twitter all the way back in the dark ages when Homebrew first started out, and then kind of followed along with some of what he does, and now here he is to talk about British 30 Core.
Welcome, Paul.
Hello, guys. Hi. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely.
And as you said, it's kind of the Maroon Mafia, which is the kind of airborne mafia, kind of dominate the story of Operation Market Garden. But just like a good British football match, it is a match of two halves, market and garden. So let's talk about garden for a change.
Yeah, and it's hard to talk about this and not think of the Edward Fox as Brian Horrocks. And the great speech. So that's why the episode's called the Cavalry, and that's it is perfect as an analogy to think about the paratroopers as the besieged homesteaders. I think Bo, I'm gonna have to do is I'm gonna have to put the clip in. I'm gonna have to find ways to clip the movie in throughout this without violating some arcane copyright thing, but. Paul, tell us a little bit about the 30 Core portion of Market Garden. So let's talk about Market.
Well, so in terms of 30 Core, you might ask yourself, some of your listeners might say, what is 30 Core? Well, the British Army divides itself up into groups of combat-ready units, and the main kind of unit in the British Army is a division. And a corps is comprised of several divisions, and above that is an army, in this case, Second Army, commanded by Dempsey, and above that is 21st Army Group, commanded by Montgomery. And 30 Corps has been fighting since D-Day. Units of 30 Corps landed on Gold Beach, for example, and fought their way inland. And they've and I think this is one of the keys to, understanding this in a better way, is as we come up to that point where Operation Market Garden is about to begin, they have just carried out an operation which is really barely known about. It's kind of a point in which the army skips from Normandy to Market Garden, and that's what they called the Great Swan. And the Great Swan was the British Army swanning its way, pushing its way across northern France and Belgium. And it advances hundreds of miles from the Seine to the Somme, up through the coalfields of northern France, across the battlefields of the Great War. These men, many of whom their dads would have been killed in the 1418 conflict, they drove past cemeteries and memorials from that war and found themselves in places like Lille, and then got to the Belgian border. And still the Germans have not fought a serious battle. They've fought lots of delaying actions, and at river points where the armies crossed, they fought kind of battle group sized operations there. And they're not giving up ground easily, but it's not a pitched battle like Normandy had been. And it seems the German army is very much on the kind of back foot. So where are they going to stop? And that advance continues on into Belgium. Brussels is liberated by the Guards Armoured Division, who would play a central role in all this. And then as they get to that top part of Belgium, that northeastern part of Belgium, up towards the border of the Netherlands, that is where the Germans have finally kind of got their act together, and that's where they're stopping, and that's where the war comes to a grinding halt. And on the 12th of September, after all this had happened, General Horrocks, or Jorrocks as the men called him, met with Montgomery at Brussels to discuss a new plan. And that plan was Operation Market Garden. This is 5 days before this is about to begin. And the Corps commander has basically kind of handed this thing on a plate. He's got to talk to the airborne planners, get his own guys involved. But essentially, they've kind of already got ground forces in the places that they need to be. And they've got this kind of momentum from the Great Swan behind them. And I think this is a key to understanding it. I think they thought they could just keep pushing on with that momentum, that the German army was still kind of on the back foot. And one thing that Horrocks, talks about in his memoirs, Corps Commander, which is an excellent account of World War II, is that he claims that he wasn't aware, for example, of the presence of large-scale SS troops in front of him. He knew that there were Fallschirmjäger units because they'd already bumped them in previous operations, and he knew that there were Luftwaffe units there and that there were Wehrmacht units there, but he wasn't quite so clear on the presence of things like 9th SS further up towards Arnhem itself. But the plan was in place. It looked simple: capture 5 bridges, an airborne carpet, drop behind enemy lines, take these bridges, and the ground troops would then advance. And you referred to that famous part of A Bridge Too Far, which I went to see when it came out, because I'm a bit older than you guys. I went to see when it came out with my dad, who was a Second World War veteran. We went to see it in the local cinema, and it was an incredible film. But I also remember him nearly knocking some guy's block off for laughing at a point when 2 paras get killed in the street underneath the bridge. And he turned around and said to him, "Just be thankful that you didn't have to see this kind of stuff for real." So that point in the film at the beginning where they meet in this theatre, and he stands there with a big map and a stick, and he kind of tells them what's happening, that pretty much is kind of what happened. They met in the theatre at Leopoldsburg, which is sadly no longer there, but they met there, and he briefed them, and that was the plan, with the Guards Armoured Division at the tip of the spear, with Lieutenant Colonel John Vandeleur, J.O.E. Vandeleur, Joe Vandeleur, as he was known. His men had just captured a bridge over the canal at that point, in which they'd tipped over into from the Belgian into the Dutch territory, and they were going to lead the attack. Him and his cousin Giles, who was the armoured commander. Joe Vandeleur was the infantry commander. By this stage of the war, the British are beginning to adopt battle groups. They'd learned from the experiences in Normandy, and this was called the Irish Guards Battle Group. So the tanks would roll into action with the infantry on the back of them, and if you encountered the enemy, the infantry would dismount, clear the enemy of their defences, and enable the tanks to move forward with both of them cooperating. And the other element to this was artillery and air support, which was now kind of an essential ingredient of how the British fought its battles on the ground, and had fought them very successfully in those latter stages of the Normandy campaign. So in this advance, for example, they had a squadron leader from the RAF embedded with the Irish Guards Battle Group, who was there to direct the Typhoons, who would come in with their 20mm and their rockets and take out kind of any targets that needed destroying. So the whole kind of approach to this had changed a lot. And I think you're kind of getting to a point where these guys are fighting quite an efficient battle with the resources that they have. And one of the differences, again, to understand in this is that this stage of the war, Britain, unlike America, was facing a manpower crisis. That we'd been at war for 5 years. We'd fought in every part of the globe. It, truly was a world war for us from almost the very beginning. And the British Army was showing the strains of that. And particularly the casualties in Normandy had made this kind of even more apparent. So one of the units in 30 Corps was the 50th Northumbrian Division, which had landed on D-Day, fought right through. It had suffered morale issues, combat performance issues, things like this. And it was getting to a point where it was starting to get a bit worn out. And that is kind of creaking at the edges is kind of a good analogy for quite a few aspects of 21st Army Group as they moved into this period of the war, thus this operation to try and end the war before Christmas.
That's a major kind of piece of it then is to try and hurry up and finish the war. And if you have to suffer casualties, let these be the last few casualties of the war.
Yeah, because no guy wants to be the last man killed on the battlefield. So,
right.
And there is already, I think, as you're moving towards the autumn of 1944, when you read the memoirs of British soldiers, there's quite a lot of reference to this already in that kind of period, because they've seen Jerry on the back foot, and they're kind of thinking maybe some kind of end is coming. But that's one element. I mean, Montgomery's huge ego is another part of it. But as good a commander as he was, and I believe he was a good commander, he was a man with a big ego. I mean, and men can't perhaps achieve things without that kind of ego. But and this plan, in a massive piece of British understatement, I would say, is incredibly bold.
I think every historian that we've talked to about Market Garden, all agrees that by this time, the British were facing, manpower issues. So how does 30 Corps officers receive sort of these preliminary drawn up battle plans of what will eventually become Operation Market Garden? Because like you said, they're kind of handed these battle plans, in 5 days, they're like, okay, let's get things rolling. How was that received?
Well, there's a saying in the British Army that if you can't take a joke, you shouldn't have joined. And I think they kind of look at these things and think, okay, so we're going to advance 60 odd miles into enemy territory, largely up one main road. Once they started looking at it, they realised that given the volume of traffic that would be needed to move an entire corps, which is thousands of vehicles, that one road wouldn't be practical. So they started looking at the roads either side of this main road, and they built in the contingency to use parts of those as well. And that is one of the things I don't think that is entirely understood. Everyone thinks they just used the one road. They didn't. There were these side roads as well. But the key issue was you needed roads with decent bridges to be able to take the weight of armoured vehicles and trucks. And not just tanks, because a big part of this was Royal Engineer sapper units that were going to come up in case the bridges that the airborne were going to hopefully capture, in case they were destroyed. So you need the ability to cross those canals and rivers that those bridges span with your own equipment. And the British Army have this, as we know from A Bridge Too Far, they have Bailey shit, as it's referred to in the film, a fine piece of British engineering that was invented by a man from Rotherham in South Yorkshire, and was kind of a bit like Meccano, really, that you could put this stuff together pretty quickly. The main sections of it could be lifted by fairly small numbers of men, so it didn't require hundreds and hundreds of guys to assemble a bridge, and it could be bolted together and moved pretty quickly. I mean, in my toilet, it's the only room in the house that doesn't have books in it, but it does have a Bailey Bridge lifting peg in it, which is a big kind of wooden thing with a metal section in the middle that slots underneath the hooks of the Bailey, so you can lift up the whole sections of the parts of the bridge and put them in place. And these bridges could be put into across rivers and canals very, very quickly. So you had to have vehicles for all that kind of stuff. So once they realised the kind of scale of this, then they needed to utilise other roads as well. So there was a lot of planning, and there was a lot of kind of side notes to the plans, and probably an element as well, particularly that they'd learned in Normandy, they're kind of making it up as you go along, because no matter, again, there's a British saying, which I know you have similar one in the US military, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And this is kind of a very much the case of any experience in Northwest Europe, 44, 45. And these guys were, kind of ready to adapt. The plan called for an advance that would get them to Arnhem Bridge within 4 days. Mm-hmm. That was the idea. Hopefully within 2 or 3. That was the initial kind of thinking, but at the most 4 days. And I think anyone who, even those who've taken part in the Great Swan and were kind of beefed up by it, would have looked at that and thought 68 miles in 4 days, not against disorganized guys, against Fallschirmjäger, against Luftwaffe group guys, and eventually SS as they discovered. This was not going to be any kind of easy undertaking in any shape or form, and it wasn't going to be as rapid as the Great Swan had been. So I'm sure there was an element of thinking, let's kind of see what happens here. Let's hope those, I guess in the back of their mind was, let's hope those airborne guys can hang on for that kind of period of time.
And while they're moving up the single road and they've got the other auxiliary roads to the side, the rest of Second Army is also still fighting on the flanks, essentially kind of as a clearing operation, pushing open the door. So that's where we see, groups like the Sherwood Rangers are off in that direction. They're fighting off on the Ephemery. So you've got this main thrust then that starts in the afternoon on the 17th. The planes are heading over, then they start moving. What's the first series of challenges that the head of the column, all 20,000 vehicles, runs into?
Well, you're right. There are these 2 corps, 12th Corps and 8th Corps, on the flanks of 30 Corps. They're not the only kind of units in Second Army, and their task is to follow up that advance as it moves forward and clear those flanks and make them secure. That doesn't entirely go to plan, as I'm sure we'll come back to. But in terms of the tip of the spear, you've got the Irish Guards battle group with the 2nd Irish Guards and 3rd Irish Guards working together with infantry and tanks. And you've got artillery with a rolling barrage, 300 plus guns dropping in front of them right across the road towards a wooded area, which is just beyond the canal where Joe's Bridge is located, which was this bridge that they captured sometime before, a few days before. The bridge had been destroyed. They built a footway across it and then put a bailey to get the tanks over. And essentially they were in a big traffic queue there waiting to move forward, with tanks right at the front, M4 Shermans, Fireflies. Every British armoured troop at that time was a mixture of 75mm equipped Shermans and a Firefly with a 17-pounder, Sherman 5. And they were going to move forward with the infantry supporting them, with the RAF embedded with them, supporting them in the air, and the gunners on the ground. And there was a huge amount of artillery from their own divisional, Guards Armoured Divisional Artillery. But by this stage of the war, the British were using what were called AGRAs, which are Army Group Royal Artilleries, where they grouped together a lot of artillery, different calibers, including aircraft in the sky. In Normandy, that included naval gunfire, but obviously we're a bit far inland for that now. But so they had a huge amount of artillery support, and this was how, again, the kind of British way of war by 1944 is that artillery played a massive part in everything that they did, partly because of this manpower issue where you could use steel against the enemy rather than flesh. That was the kind of idea, because you could replace steel, but you couldn't necessarily easily replace flesh.
Mm-hmm. So, Paul, you mentioned that it doesn't go to plan. So why doesn't it?
Well, the Germans are dug in on tree lines. The road at that point is elevated, so the tanks on it present pretty good targets to gunners. The barrage drops a hell of a lot of shells. There are some German casualties. They've got SS troops on their right. They've got Fallschirmjäger directly in front of them along the tree-lined area. They've got every gun to the British was an 88, but they had a mixture of anti-tank weapons. Their 75mm could knock out a Sherman at that kind of range. So, and you had a lot of kind of no fixed front line. It's not like the First World War with a static trench, no man's land. This is fluid. So the Germans had a lot of men in foxholes, in ditches by the side of the road. Panzernacker platoons, kind of anti-tank platoons, which are going to go out and take on enemy tanks, in this case the Irish Guards. So as they move towards Valkenswaard, which is the town that they're heading towards in the Netherlands, and they kick off at just after 14:35 on the 17th of September. They'd seen the airborne guys go over. This is the other frustrating bit, I think, for them, is they can't attack at dawn because the airborne guy is going to do a daylight drop. So they have to wait for that to happen before they can begin their advance. And as they move forward, it's broad daylight. The weather's a kind of bit mixed for September, but it's still pretty good visibility. And as they move forward, guys with Panzerfausts by the side of the road take out tanks. The tanks are hit by anti-tank gunfire, and very quickly, quite a few tanks get knocked out, which crams the road up with burning wrecks and immobilized vehicles and so on. So the thing begins to break down. And at that point, what the British would do is call in the aggro, call in the artillery support. So drop artillery on the areas where they reckon they're taking this fire from, bring in the Typhoons to drop rockets and cannon fire on it and so on. And gradually, doing this kind of piecemeal attack, they move forward and they get to Valkenswaard on the evening of the first day. So at that point, they've entered Dutch territory. They've got to their first Dutch town. They're on this road, but they still haven't met up with any airborne guys. They're still on their way. So day one is used up, and they've only had half a day, really. And they didn't advance at night. A decision was taken that it would be too risky to move this amount of tanks up a narrow corridor in the darkness. And many of these guys, although they're driven in the darkness in the Great Swan, that was fine when you were not up against an enemy. Mm-hmm. But when you were up against stiff opposition, there was a different prospect altogether.
And you just brought up something that I think is a really important point, because one of the major criticisms that the para side of Market Garden would throw at 30 Corps was that, well, they started late. They waited until after the airborne had already flown over. And you make the point, and I just, in the second you said it, I went, oh, duh. If you start the armor forward, you've got Germans then in combat engaged, and you're going to have airborne troops dropping into essentially a hot LZ, and their drop zones, their landing zones would be overrun with Germans moving towards the threat, not running away from it. At least when they land generally unopposed for the most part. They're able to engage. We talked with John McManus, who'd mentioned, that when Gavin and the 82nd jump, they run into some light resistance early on, but by and large, everybody's able to move where they're supposed to go. If 30 Corps starts moving and you're throwing and lobbing artillery from the Agra in, you're not going to be able to land any of those guys.
No, and I think as well that, the Germans were taken by surprise with the airborne operations. The Germans at that stage of the war must have looked in great envy at the ability of the Allies to pull together thousands of ships to pull off D-Day, and thousands of aircraft and gliders to pull off airborne operations both in Normandy and then Market Garden. And but they were not ready for this. But I think if you'd have begun a 3 different corps advance, because there's 30 corps attacking, those 2 flanking corps are attacking as well, then you're kind of saying, well, the Germans have only got to look at a map, and they don't really ever react very well to feint operations. They're never taken in by the idea that if the British attack here, it's a kind of a feint because they're trying to draw Germans away from something. That never works. And the Germans would only have to look at a map, see where that road went. And if nothing else, if they didn't clock Arnhem, they definitely would have clocked Nijmegen. So they would have kind of put resources in place to prevent that from happening. So if you did it the other way round, with armoured ground forces attacking first and then airborne, I think we would be discussing a very different kind of operation with even greater scale potentially of airborne casualties.
And even at the pace that 30 Corps moves, the Germans actually react very, very quickly, because they've got vehicles that are supposed to be sent back to Berlin with the SS units that are going to get out and be essentially demobbed and put there. And they unload them, put them back together, and get those guys back out into the field. So even if 30 Corps makes that advance through the day and they advance all night, by the next morning they would run into armored resistance.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because the Germans are pretty good at reacting to situations and being able to form. I know there are some historians now who kind of mock the Germans for having Kampfgruppers, for having battle groups. I mean, if it was that bad of an approach, I don't think that the British Army, and to a certain element, the Americans, I mean, a regimental combat team is not much different to a battle group, really. And that kind of use of that kind of integrated military force with elements from different parts of how the army functions is an essential part, way of winning operations and battles and actions on the ground. And the Germans, like you say, I mean, if you look at some of the photographs of some of the vehicles that the British knocked out or overran, I mean, they're absolute wrecks, some of them, with whole sections of plating off. And because a lot of this stuff is stuff that got out of Falaise and was dragged through northern France and Belgium, in some cases quite literally dragged. And they've got it up there ready for refitting and rest. And all of a sudden, the enemy allies arrive, and they've got to get it moving again and get it down to a battle space to start fighting. And the Germans are pretty good at doing that, really. So that resistance, starts to appear pretty quickly, with static units already holding that front, but other units coming in pretty quickly to try and break that line of advance.
When it comes to warfare, we're always thinking of big picture stuff, but when it comes to, actual boots on the ground, actual logistics, it's a conundrum sometimes, because you don't think, well, what happens if, my armor does take, heavy fire and is disabled? What do we do from there? And sort of both, the Germans and the British, have this ability to think on their feet to a certain extent. But Paul, I wanted to talk about something, because you'd mentioned a little earlier that, members of 30 Corps are traveling over some of the old battlefields of their fathers. And I'm curious, in your research, if you ever came across any member from 30 Corps who maybe jotted something down in a personal journal, sort of the psychological effects of traversing over, World War I era battlefields.
Well, it's, I mean, over the years, I mean, I work as a battlefield guide, and I've done for many, many years, in 30 years now. And for the last 27, I've been doing tours into this kind of ground, from Normandy up to Market Garden and beyond. And I've had a lot of veterans travel with me. I had one guy actually who came on a First World War tour with me, because his dad was on the Menin Gate. And the last time that he'd seen his dad's name was in September 1944, when he suddenly realised that his truck that was en route to Operation Market Garden come through the city of Ypres, suddenly realised the Menin Gate with his dad's name was on it. He knew where his dad was commemorated. He jumped off the back of the truck, shouts all round, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" or words to that effect, slightly less polite. And he runs up, touches his dad's name on the gate, and then runs down the road and jumps on the next available truck to continue with his journey. And the next time he saw that was in the late 1990s with me. So I think for a lot of them, they felt it was extraordinary. I mean, one guy, an officer in the 51st Highland Division, writes an account in a book called "So Few Got Through," and he says suddenly we were on the battlefields of our father's war, where they were locked in combat for 4 long years, and we traversed it in just a matter of hours. And I think that was the kind of shock to them, really. And these were familiar names to them, the Somme. I mean, British units from 30 Corps fought around Albert, which is the town in the heart of the 1916 Somme battlefields. And, they knocked out a German tank case on the road right near the Albert Communal Cemetery in the middle of the town. So it's kind of one of these places where the First World War meets the Second.
So one of the go ahead. I did that thing where I talked over you again.
No, I mean, it's just unique to me, because it's when you're reading into the First World War, this was supposed to be the war to end all wars, and realistically, we know that was never going to happen. But it's unique to see sort of the crossover paths. And I imagine that's got to do something to someone's psyche, because I'm sure you hear the stories of veterans and fathers who've come before you, and it's kind of depressing for them, because they're seeing their sons go through the same thing, if not worse.
Yeah, I mean, Horrocks himself was a veteran of the First World War. He was captured in his first, he was a regular pre-war regular officer. He arrived as a replacement in the 4th Middlesex after they'd been chewed up in the Battle of Mons in August 1914. And in their next action in October, he was taken prisoner and spent the rest of the war as a POW. So, there were men in 30 Corps who'd actually been there a generation before, advancing through that ground. I think commander of the 94th Field Regiment in the Wessex Division was also a Great War veteran who'd fought in that area. So there were these kind of crisscross paths of it all. But the youngsters amongst it must have been baffled, really, by the thought that they could cross that ground that had seen such incredible kind of fighting for 4 years in just, a day, basically.
And not to sort of belabor the point, but you think about the Army Group commander, Monty. He's a World War I veteran, and in his mind, what's he trying to do? He's trying to prevent another World War I while also capitalizing on what he thinks is a 1918 style collapse of the German army, which is the point we were making with John. And listener and viewer, you will see this later on in the week. That collapse isn't happening. But in your mind, you've seen it, you've lived it once, you know what it looked like, you know what it smelled like, and it sure does kind of look similar. And then all of a sudden the Germans hold up. And then you've got this armored column punching up the road, and all bets really hinge on 1st Airborne and para battalions capturing the bridges at Arnhem. You've got the 82nd at Nijmegen and the 101st at Eindhoven, and all of a sudden we start running in with one another. So what's the first link up like for 30 Corps and the Americans?
So on the first day they get to Valkenswaard, and then the next day, so this is second day of operation on the 18th of September, they continue with that advance. It's not that far between Valkenswaard and Eindhoven, and that is the main southern drop area of 101st Airborne. And that's where 30 Corps begins to meet up with airborne forces. Now, some of the recce elements of these units had already met up with the Americans, but this is not what you call, this is a provisional link up. I mean, a few recce armoured cars, some Daimlers, an AEC and a Dingo or whatever. It's not going to take on the rest of the German army all the way to Arnhem, but it's a symbolic thing, really. But the main forces begin to meet up on that day. But Zonn Bridge to the north of Eindhoven's been blown by the Germans. So what becomes the important factor there is not so much fighting, but it's getting these engineer columns up through the fighting troops, down through side streets and the other roads that they'd already kind of provisionally looked at, to get it up to the canal, to get a bailey across that. And that takes the rest of the day through the night. They drag in some German prisoners of war to assist the sappers in getting this thing built as quickly as possible. And I don't think it was necessarily a record for a bailey, but it went up pretty quickly. But it was not functioning until really properly the next day, when they begin their advance now on day 3. Remember, they're going to get to Arnhem by day 4. This is day 3. They're just pulling out of Eindhoven and crossing the canal at Zonn, and they're moving up towards the next airborne division, which is 82nd. They've captured that ground from above Eindhoven up to Nijmegen, and that's where they run into them at the Grave Bridge, which is quite a substantial bridge. With multiple spans. Thank God the Germans didn't blow that, because that would have taken a huge feat of engineering to put a bailey bridge to replace that, but that was captured. And on one of my trips over the years, I've taken a lot of 30 Corps vets back to these places, and I had one guy, Roy, who was in a light anti-aircraft unit, so they had Bofors guns on Morris tractors, so self-propelled, because they're part of the Guards Armoured Division. And he was sent forward to establish some anti-aircraft artillery defence for that bridge, literally kind of shortly after it had been captured. So they were kind of in the vanguard of the advance. And he pulled up there expecting to see some tanks and British soldiers there. There was no one around. And then they pulled up in their Morris tractors, and they kind of looked around, couldn't see any Germans. And then gradually in the grass by the side of the bridge, these helmets gradually came out of the grass. And these were 82nd airborne guys that had been seeing what they were, who they were. They'd probably never seen a Morris tractor with a Bofors gun on the back of it, and they realised they were Tommies rather than German soldiers. So that was the kind of link up. So that begins to happen. So things are moving more successfully now. But you're on day 3. You've used up 3 of your supposed 4 days as you're kind of cranking towards Arnhem, and that goes well. And they get into the outskirts of Nijmegen on that day. But Nijmegen is a big city with a big bridge across the Waal River.
And lots of fighting happening everywhere all at once.
Lots of fighting. And of course, the Americans are also fighting a subsidiary battle, which you probably covered in another episode, over towards the Grosbeak Heights, which is tying up a lot of 82nd guys. So there's that going on. Guards armoured into Nijmegen, and that's much more urban. And the Germans are defending part of the outskirts. So there's fighting in the streets, anti-tank guns set up at road junctions and stuff like that. So they start to lose tanks, they start to lose infantry, and the kind of momentum of that advance breaks down quite a lot, really. And the next phase is the link up with the troops, with airborne, 82nd Airborne in Nijmegen to get to that bridge. And the bridge has not been captured. And it requires an operation to take it. So this is day 4 now. So it's day 4 at Arnhem Bridge. What's left of John Frost's 700 and something men who've gone in there, 2nd Battalion guys, foot police, military policemen rather, and Remy guys, and some recce guys did get to the bridge despite the kind of mythology of Arnhem. So, there's that kind of stuff. They're hanging on with the last of their fingernails. Finally, these guys, 30 Corps, have met up with American Airborne, and they're about to take on Nijmegen Bridge with a river crossing, the famous river crossing across the Waal, with the Grenadier Guards battle group going forward to take the bridge simultaneously. Again, the kind of film portrays it as if the airborne guys, the task was to get them across and then get the British across, and it kind of didn't work like that. You needed to capture, as they said, both ends of the bridge. I think they say it in the film, both ends of the bridge at once. And the only way to do that is to send an armoured column across there. And I'm kind of old enough to remember the video games like Medal of Honor, Allied Assault and things like that. I mean, one of the missions was kind of on Nijmegen Bridge. And when you read the actual real account of that, where these Grenadier Guards guys are going across that bridge, it sounds like something out of Medal of Honor, to be honest with you, because they've got guys, snipers up on the bridge stanchions. They've got Panzerfaust teams hitting them left, right and centre. They've got 88s firing from across the river at them. So they lose tanks on the bridge, but they do get across and they meet up with the airborne guys. So this is the 20th of September. They've got across Nijmegen Bridge. There's been heavy losses in the Guards, heavy losses in the 82nd Airborne guys. One of the things you don't often read about, actually, with that river crossing is that the Royal Engineers in 30 Corps supplied them with some additional boats so they could take anti-tank weapons across the river, so that they could have anti-tank guns to support their bridgehead if the Guards took a bit longer than anticipated. But anyway, that is kind of sorted. And there's that famous moment where Lord Carrington, who was a Guards officer, who became Britain's Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs during the Falklands War, he was a young Guards officer there commanding one of these tanks. And this is portrayed in A Bridge Too Far. They don't name Carrington, but it's him. And he gets to that part of the bridge and they stop. And in the film, they stop, of course. What do British soldiers do as soon as they stop?
Make tea.
They make tea. And I'm sure that if there was any veteran tank crews, which most of them would have been, the first thing they would have been doing was to make some kind of brew up if they didn't have something on the go already. But there was an issue. And I know there is this account of some 82nd Airborne guys frustrated with these tanks, saying, come on, we'll go up this road together. Those are your guys. I think he says, those are your guys dying in Arnhem. And all of that is true, but there is a big issue here. First of all, tanks cannot advance without infantry. Okay, there's 82nd Airborne guys there, but they are not trained, either of them, to cooperate with each other.
Yeah.
The British and the Americans generally don't fight well side by side in the Second World War. And if you try and put an American unit into battle with a British unit, or vice versa, they have two very different approaches to fighting, and those approaches don't always mix very well. And I think if you look at the history of combined operations from the First World War through to modern times, you can see that issue repeated again and again. And it's not a criticism of anybody, but it's the mentality behind different militaries, you know. And it would have been true in a Cold War gone hot, with the kind of mishmash of units up on the North German plain around the British Army of the Rhine, with Dutch there, with West Germans and so on. That kind of cooperation under the stress of combat would have broken down. And certainly in the midst of this operation, the idea of a load of airborne guys jumping on the back of some British tanks and, you know, charging up that road towards Arnhem, there would have only been one outcome of that, and it wouldn't have been good.
How do you like it for homebrew history to be so consistent across the board? Because everyone we've had on has said exactly the same thing, is that you can't link up 30 Corps with the 82nd Airborne. It won't work, and it won't work for a myriad of reasons. And then the other thing to add into that, 30 Corps is still fighting to get through Nijmegen. Yeah, some of the tanks have made it across the bridge, but the rest of the vehicles are still down the road, and there's still guys that haven't really crossed out of the 101st Airborne yet. They're still coming up. There's no way you can move the entire column all at once in that punch up the road. So now we get to the big crisis point, right? And one of the things that I really have enjoyed, and Bo, I know I told you this, I started reading September Hope probably a week and a half ago, rereading for the first time in probably 6 or 7 years, with the intent to finish it on the 17th, which right now I'm on track to do. We'll see. But one of the things that John McManus is so great about in talking in this is he talks about the great relationship that the 101st, the 82nd, and 1st Airborne all had with one another. They had trained with each other when they were back in England. They had prepped for all of the various operations leading up to this with one another. They had prepped for Market Garden together in this kind of 7 days slam bam as fast as you can. And you establish a relationship between these highly elite, highly motivated troops. And you get the 82nd Airborne, fire in their bellies. They just crossed over the Vol River. They'd been shot at. They finally got a chance to deliver a punch of their own against the Germans. And then all of a sudden, they stop. And we can talk about stopping to drink tea, and we can do all of that. But they stop. And it's enough, I think, to frustrate the moment, maybe. But then once the armor starts moving, and once the infantry starts moving, they've still got to close this gap from Nijmegen to Arnhem. And to do it, they have to go on, I would argue, probably the most perilous portion of the route.
Yeah, it's not the best part. I mean, one of the great things about, you know, walking the ground when you visit these battlefields is you get a sense of geography. And I think a lot of people think the road from Joe's Bridge all the way to Arnhem is exactly the same along every square mile of it. It isn't. It's very different terrain with raised roads, normal roads, wood-sided roads, you know, all that kind of stuff, and then urban areas. And then you get to that bit between Nijmegen and Arnhem, and that is not a good bit at all, because not so much the road is raised for part of it, but it's got a very steep raised railway embankment on the left side of the road. And there's only one point between Nijmegen and Arnhem in which you can cross that, and that's at Elst with sizable armored vehicles. And that becomes a pinch point. So at this stage, that one of the reasons why the Guards and Carrington wouldn't have continued with that advance, no matter who had been there, if it had been, you know, the rear element of 1st Airborne who'd made that crossing at Nijmegen, I don't think it would have been any different, is that they were running out of steam. They'd suffered losses, they had fuel issues, probably ammunition issues, they'd taken casualties. As you mentioned, the infantry were behind them, all that kind of stuff. So this is where you start to see the leapfrogging. So the next division moves up now, which is the 43rd Wessex Division, commanded by Ivor Thomas. And they've been fighting since Normandy. They've fought in some of the toughest parts of the Normandy campaign, like Hill 112, for example. They crossed the Seine at Vernon, and so on. And there's some great memoirs, some great battalion histories of the units in that division that give us a very good kind of insight into this. And they had some very good battalion commanders in that division, including Lieutenant Colonel Taylor, who commanded 5th Battalion, Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry, the DCLI. And he decided to try and bypass the failure that was ahead of him, because they were trying to push up this road towards Elst, not getting anywhere, certainly not getting any, much closer to Arnhem. So he did what was called the Driel Dash. Now, Driel is a village on the banks of the Lower Rhine, almost directly opposite Oosterbeek. And he took essentially his own kind of battle group of infantry in the battalion motor pool vehicles. He got every vehicle he could get his hand on, 30 weights and all this kind of stuff. Chucked a load of guys in there with weapons, took some DUKWs, the amphibious trucks, and some tanks from 4th 7th Dragoon Guards, and headed by this circuitous route, not trying to take the Germans on, but bypass them. So it's a stealth advance, this. It's not, let's go and bump the enemy and we'll take them full pelt. We're going to go around them and we're going to get to Driel and see if we can somehow link up with the airborne division there by taking these ducks across. And they do get to Driel. And at the same time, on the radio net, one of the medium regiments, 64th Medium Regiment, has finally heard some news from 1st Airborne Division, because one of the things you've got to remember, up to this point, 30 Corps has no idea what is happening at Arnhem. Mm-hmm. And suddenly this medium regiment with some decent radio sets picks up messages from 1st Airborne Division with similar radio sets. Mm-hmm. So again, the kind of mythology of radio sets not working at all is not true, but they've got to have the right sets to talk to the right sets and all this kind of stuff. And the range is obviously an issue. And they hear that 1st Airborne Division is still there, which is kind of even further impetus for Colonel Taylor to get this dash up to the Rhine at Driel. And he makes it. He meets up with Zozabowski's Polish airborne guys there. So there's a link up between airborne troops in that area and ground troops and 30 Corps. But the banks of that part of the Lower Rhine are so steep that the ducks struggle to get down there, and it kind of fizzles out. So it's a bit of dash, quite literally, in every kind of meaning of the word, but it doesn't really achieve what they'd hoped to, which is set up some kind of proper link. It does put them in a position where they can now overlook Oosterbeek, and there's an important element there in that these AGRAs, the Army Group Royal Artillery, so all the artillery support for 30 Corps, mm-hmm. can now be utilised to support 1st Airborne Division. And over the next couple of days, they send forward observation officers, FOOs, over mm-hmm. to the airborne side. So they go across on boats or ducks, so that you've got your own gunner officers over there with the airborne guys directing heavy artillery from Nijmegen. And some of those, which you've probably spoken about with Joe Hook, I would guess, some of those kind of later attacks where they throw in some pretty heavy armour against the Oosterbeek perimeter, mm-hmm. are broken up by 30 Corps artillery bombardments. Mm-hmm. So that's an important element. But at the same time, the big push up the road is fizzling out, and it's fizzling out, and it's fizzling out to a point where it's becoming apparent that they're not going to get there.
Mm-hmm. What's that moment of realization? Where does that...
I think it's Elst, I think, really, is that they can't really get beyond Elst, and that in that area, and the weather changes, mm-hmm. so it means that you can't send tanks across the fields because it's boggy, it's not suitable for armoured operations. You've got to stick to the roads. Mm-hmm. The Germans command those roads. They've chucked everything into that point to defend that point where the railway line comes off the embankment into a crossing point at Elst, because they know it's so vital, and it remains actually a contested front line for weeks and months after Operation Market Garden. The Wessex Division holds the line there, loses tons of guys with these to and fro battles in that area, and they realise they're not going to get any further. And now they've made some kind of radio and ground link up between them and 1st Airborne by sending these blokes across the river. Then that's the point in which they realise that this is not any longer an advance to Arnhem. It's now going to be an evacuation from Arnhem. And I think at that point, probably none of those in 30 Corps knew what had happened to the men at the bridge. And possibly there were these kind of last messages from the bridge, from Frost to Urquhart and so on. You know, I suspect the position even in Urquhart's mind wasn't entirely clear as to what had happened there at that moment. You know, a lot of this didn't come out until after the war, when these guys came back from prisoner of war camps. You know, in the case of Frost, he went off to a number of camps before he returned, and when the fighting was over. But the whole, now they've realised, you know, this is what, 23rd, 24th of September. They want to secure a bridgehead on the other side of the Lower Rhine. So 4th Dorsets, which is a unit in the Wessex Division, sent over to form a bridgehead alongside the airborne guys. That's an absolute disaster, where they take heavy losses. They only get 350 odd guys over, and of them, only a handful ever come back. They have a memorial now on what's called the Wester Bowing Heights, looking down over that bit of the river where they crossed. And when you go there, there's a very nice little cafe where you can sit and have a coffee or a beer, and look down, you know, to the river, and you can see those guys just didn't have a chance crossing at that point, because if the Germans commanded those heights, which they pretty much did, then anyone's going to get chewed up trying to get across that bit of ground. So at the tail end of it, I think there's this realization amongst 30 Corps that it's a spent operation now. They've gone as far as they can, and they've got to salvage something from it. I mean, they've travelled, if we look at the plus side of it, they've travelled 60 miles, which is quite something. But they haven't got to Arnhem. And of course, Arnhem wasn't the final objective anyway. They were going to push through Arnhem and carry on to the other side of Arnhem to get up into these areas where they could exploit that to get into the Third Reich. So it's kind of, you know, bridge too far. Even the naming of it is kind of, it creates a myth in its own right that everything was about Arnhem Bridge. But they certainly were not going to get through Arnhem at that moment, and probably for some time to come, which is exactly what happens, because Arnhem doesn't fall until April 1945, when the Canadians and the British units supporting them take it.
I feel like the mythos of the Second World War could be an entire podcast in its own.
Oh, God. Yeah.
You know, but Paul, we do have a segment on this show that discusses, you know, the boohickey behind something, whether you found in your research or that a common misconception that you kind of want to dispel. And when it comes to Operation Market Garden, it seems like that list is ever growing, because everyone we've talked to about Market Garden, they're like, oh, well, there's this. Like, well, but if I could boil it down to one thing, it would be X, Y, Z, you know? So Paul, what is something that either people get wrong about Market Garden? What is something that people misconstrue that you want to set straight?
Well, I mean, going back to, you know, the beginning of our discussion where we spoke about that meeting with Horrocks, with these officers in the theatre at Leopoldsburg, the idea that they were the kind of cavalry marching in to relieve those, you know, surrounded at the far end, and that they were going to get there, not rush, not get there too quickly, but get there just in time. I think that has kind of cemented an idea in people's mind that somehow Horrocks and 30 Corps didn't push hard enough to get to Arnhem. But when you look at what they were doing and the opposition they were up against, and you've got to remember that for 4 of the days during this operation, the Germans, this is something we haven't spoken about, the Germans cut the 30 Corps route. So they launched attacks into the side of it and overran it or cut it. And you had guys that normally would be nowhere near combat, so Royal Army Service Corps petrol lorry drivers and things like that, suddenly shooting at Germans with pistols from their lorry cabs, because they're surrounded by Jerry as he's overrunning the road that they're meant to be driving up to deliver petrol or ammunition or whatever it is to a particular location. So I think the idea that 30 Corps didn't push hard enough to relieve those airborne guys is a total myth. And it wasn't that they were kind of running out of steam in themselves, but they were up against tough opposition, and to advance up a narrow front, because it wasn't, again, that's another myth, it wasn't just one road, but advancing up a narrow front where you've got enemy all around you, and the corps who are meant to be in supporting you on your flanks had not got as far forward as you would have liked them to be, meant that you're always going to run up against this kind of issues when it comes to the timetable of it. And I think that's where the plan unravels, is that the timetabling of it is very, very ambitious, and based, I am sure, on their collective experience of what had happened in the Great Swan, where the Germans had buckled and then advanced hundreds of miles without almost any opposition. And there is some thought, actually, that if, at the end of the film, they all stand on that church spire and they all come up with where did it go wrong? Well, in many respects, I think there's a kind of current thought now that essentially the operation happened too late. That if it had happened the week before, so literally as they'd taken Brussels and they'd sent, a real...
If it would have been on the Comet timeline as opposed to its own, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And because the Germans were definitely far more disorganized at that point. And, if there's going to be a what if for that, the what if would have been if they'd have got in at that moment, if the airborne had been ready, if the transports had been available, all these kind of factors that hindered the plan, and if that had all been there, then the outcome could have been different. But given what they were moving into now, a far more organized enemy, than the ground troops, no matter what ground troops they were. I've travelled to Arnhem with First Airborne Division veterans who were in POW camps that were liberated by American troops, and they often spoke about how they spoke to these guys, and the Americans had said to them, the GIs had said, if it had been us on the ground, we'd have got you. And that's a kind of great thought, but I think that even someone blood and guts himself in charge of this kind of wouldn't have made any difference, because if you can't expand your bridgehead beyond a narrow column of a road, not much else besides that, then you're always going to come across issues. And Patton never fought, and the Americans never fought an action like that, and thankfully on this kind of scale no one has fought anything like it since. So, and I know that, I think certainly one of the other kind of myths of this is that that there's certain military schools that will lay this kind of concept in front of students, and if they follow the 30 Corps plan, then they fail and they're booted, their sword is broken over their knee, and they're thrown out of the military. But the plan itself was not the problem. It was the timetable.
The timetable, and then forgetting that the enemy has a vote type of thing. Yeah.
And I think that the Great Swan, which I've mentioned a few times, is an element of this that I don't think is understood well enough. And there is not a single book on it. There's kind of nothing really. And the influence of that on what had happened within British forces at that time, I think, was significant, really, and can't be underestimated, particularly amongst senior officers, because if you'd have been bogged down as they were in the bocage for so long, and suddenly you're advancing a few hundred miles across France and into Belgium and almost to the Netherlands, then you're going to think, this looks like it's coming to an end. But it wasn't.
Is there a good single volume on 30 Corps' role in Market Garden?
They published an official history after the war called Club Route, and that was the name of the route that they drove from Normandy through to the end of the war. And that's their kind of, which is quite good on Arnhem. It kind of skips round some of the issues, I think, and it's not overly. It's an official history written for men who served in 30 Corps. So it was published actually in Germany in 1946. A lot of the guys who ended up in Germany at the end of the war did publish unit histories before they were demobilized, before they were sent demobbed and sent home. And this is kind of one of those. But there's also Geoffrey Powell's book called The Devil's Birthday, which is about the bridges at Arnhem, which obviously touches on the airborne side of it, but it's a big chunk of it is about the ground side of it. But is he a hostile witness? Because he served in 156 Battalion at Arnhem he was in the 1st Airborne Division. So you could argue straight away that he's got a kind of axe to grind that 30 Corps never turned up. And I I've met many First Airborne veterans who have no idea that 4th Dorsets came over, no idea that they had embedded foos from 30 Corps artillery units and things like that. So I think that kind of belief that somehow 30 Corps never got anywhere near them is something that was believed amongst the veterans themselves and continues to be believed to this day. And that's certainly 30 Corps is not without criticism, but I think that the task that they faced was probably an impossible one.
Yeah. It's good to at least get a defense of 30 Corps, even if it was, they did okay, but here's some, so all that is good. Bo, we've got one last segment. Paul, what's in your cup?
Well, because it's kind of, I've just finished work today, so I've only got coffee at the moment, but it is French coffee. I lived in France for a long while, so I kind of only tend to drink French coffee. But having lived in Europe for a long time, in my cupboard there are some very nice Belgian beers, Trappist beers, which would normally be brought out for an occasion like this. Yeah.
Bo, how about yourself?
So I am not done with work for today. I actually have to go to work a little bit later today, but I'm trying something new. It's a particular type of energy drink, and it tastes. I don't know how I feel about it. The taste is apparently a sparkling mandarin marshmallow, and for our American listeners, it kind of has the aftertaste of a Lucky Charms marshmallow, and I'm not really quite sure how I feel about it. But it is caffeine, and historians run on caffeine, so it's coursing through my veins at the moment. So, Joey, how about yourself?
Well, not that at all. Bo, I took a play out of your playbook because I don't have work later today. This is my day off, so cup of coffee, nice little pour of 4 roses in the bottom of it. So. Bourbon coffee this morning.
And away from Monty to make an appearance.
Huh?
And away for Monty to make an appearance.
And away for Monty to show up. Look at that. There he is. All of his glory. There he is. Look. We have props, okay? We use props.
You need a battle dress at the back of you there as well, to represent these 30 Corps guys.
I'll go grab it. It's right in the other room.
Good.
Don't worry. Actually, I've got a Royal Artillery battle dress right in here. I should grab
that
good one. Yeah, there we go. British stuff is amazing to find in the U.S., largely because most people don't know
what it is,
or what it should cost. So you walk up and like, I'll give you $40 for it, and you walk out $40 later, full. I mean, battle dress, shirt, pants. Whole 9. I got it all. The only thing missing is the hat, but that can be
very nice. Much more difficult to find here these days. When I was a kid, we used to have the kind of junk shops right across southern England where I grew up, and they would be full of this kind of stuff. But it's all on eBay or specialist online dealers now. So those days are getting rarer and rarer to find a goodie tucked away.
Well, Paul, this has been fantastic, and I think this is a great addition. Bo, I don't know if you agree. I hope you do. I think this has been a great addition to what we've talked about, because we've talked, and dear listener, you're going to see all of this as we go. We've talked about the Americans. We've talked about some of the notable figures and some of the equipment used and carried. We talked about that with Marty, and we've talked with John McManus, and then of course Joe Hook has talked with us about memorializing Market Garden. We've got a couple other guests we're trying to keep under wraps for another week or so. But this is all kind of in hopes that you'll get a chance to listen to this for a week's worth of episodes and really get kind of an understanding of not only just the enormity of the operation, but all of its various kind of facets, and how can you forget 30 Corps. So
not at all.
With that, Paul, fantastic. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
friends, listeners, viewers, get over there and check out Old Frontline on YouTube. And this is the perfect time to remind you, all of you folks sitting at home, that Homebrew History is brought to you by Civil War Trails. Civil War Trails, a place where you can get out there and make some history of your own. Venture across the country following the trails from Central Virginia up to Maryland. Follow the route of the Antietam campaign. Be there with George McClellan. Oh, Drew's going to love it when I say this. Be there with George McClellan when he does nothing. Be there with Robert E. Lee when he retreats back into Virginia. Follow the routes. Follow the trails. Get out there and make some history of your own. Make sure you snap a picture with those Civil War Trails markers using the hashtag #SignedSelfie and tag Civil War Trails on social media. Help other people learn about the largest outdoor museum in existence. Look at that. It's like I do this all the time. Anyhow, there's that. Back from Market Garden 80. We'll see you next time. Bo, see you in about 25 minutes when we do this all over again.
Cheers to that. Paul, it's great to have you, man.
Yep. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate it. And speak soon. Take care.